Hello, fellow birders. My name is Dennis Kania. Today we're going to be taking a look at potential problems you might encounter with fall warbler identification. On the DuPage Birding Club Education channel, we'll be discussing all things bird related. And today, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at some identification problems you may encounter during the fall warbler migration. Previously on our mini tutorial series, we've covered some fall warbler identification puzzles. If you have not reviewed these tutorials, check them out. They are full of helpful hints, and if you have reviewed them, then it might not hurt to go back and have a second look. There's really a lot of information packed in there. So some of the previous released titles that we have, we did talk about water thrushes and how to separate those. And we had a tutorial that covered the yellow female warblers, which would include yellow warbler, hooded warbler, and Wilson's warbler. We also had a tutorial on separating Connecticut female warblers from mourning female warblers. And then we covered more recently fall warblers in Tennessee orange crown and Nashville warblers, all in fall plumage. And then also bay-breasted, blackpoll pine, and chestnut-sided in fall plumage. In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at some more subtle issues. Fall northern parula versus magnolia warbler, drab first-year yellow warblers, Cape May warblers versus yellow-rumped warblers, first-year female black-throated blue warblers, and first-year Blackburnian warbler versus first-year black-throated green warbler. Let's first take a look at the northern parula versus magnolia warbler. And you'll find, even though it seems like it's an unusual comparison to be making, that there are a lot of characteristics that these birds share. You'll find that in the fall, you can encounter individuals of magnolia warbler that'll have a bicolored bill. And that's something we standardly look for in a northern parula. And you can see here the bicolored bill in this individual, and you can see it here as well. And then on occasion, you'll have magnolia warblers, which will have a split eye ring, meaning there's an eye line running through the eye ring, and so you end up with an upper and lower crescent of that eye ring remaining. And that's a characteristic that we normally look for on northern parulas, and you can see it quite clearly here, that there's a broken eye ring, and you can see it's a rather well-developed crescent of white above and below the eye. And both individuals do have a yellow throat and yellow upper breast, and there can be a little grayish collar on the northern parulas. And you can find the same thing on magnolias, and you'll see that again, the yellow throat, yellow upper breast, and the hint of a collar here on this individual. And not all of our magnolia warblers will have all of these characteristics, but you can run into individuals that look like that. And lastly, the northern parula is known to have a triangle of olive green on the back, and in fall plumage, we can have that same characteristic on magnolia warblers. So now the differences that we'd be looking for to separate these out, one would include the wing bar format. And you can see the median and greater coverts located right here. Here are the greater coverts, here are the median coverts. You can see that the outer feathers of those feather tracts are tipped in white, but then as you work your way in towards the inner part of the wing, you don't have those white tips. So you end up with what I say is a short wing bar. If we look at magnolia warbler, you can see that through the feather tract, both the median coverts and the greater coverts, and it's even more noticeable here, you can see that all of the feathers are marked the same. So from the outer edge of the greater coverts all the way through to the inner edge of the greater coverts, all of those feathers are tipped in white. So you end up with a wing bar that looks quite long compared to what you're seeing in a northern parula. And if the magnolia warbler is foraging around and spreading its tail at all, you should be able to see that there is a white rectangle on both sides. It's not visible here, but you can clearly see it here towards the base of the tail, and that's quite diagnostic. Magnolia warbler does have a yellow rump, which would be lacking on northern parula. And the yellow on a the underparts of a magnolia warbler, I mentioned that they have a yellow throat, yellow upper breast. Well, that yellow does extend way down to the belly on magnolia warblers, and there on occasion there'll be some streaking going on as well. That would all be lacking on our northern parallels. You can see that the yellow stops much more abruptly here, and it's just the upper part of the breast that's yellow. Now we're going to take a look at yellow warblers. It's a species of warbler that we don't encounter very often in the fall because they do migrate out fairly early in the season. And they're usually gone before we even start thinking about looking at fall warblers. If we encounter a nice bright yellow individual like this, we're not going to have any problems. And you can see that there's a lot of yellow in the tail here. The tail obviously is flared out because the bird is in the hand. You wouldn't normally see that from the upper surface. But the reason I have this in here is just to show you just how much yellow there is in that tail. In our previous videos, I've mentioned that you can always identify a yellow warbler because every single feather in the wing and in the tail is edged in yellow. And you can see that here in this individual. But as you get to duller and duller birds in the fall, I find them even duller than this, you'll find that sometimes you can't discern that there's actually yellow in those edges on both the wing and the tail. This one's showing it still a little bit, but I have seen individuals that have even less than that. So then the next surefire way that you can identify this as a yellow warbler is to get a good look at the underside of the tail. And out of all of our warblers, the yellow warbler is the only one that's going to have yellow areas in the underside of the tail. I'm not talking about the undertail coverts, but the tail itself. And you can see that there's some yellow in here. And that's all of this yellow showing up that we're seeing from this upper surface. When the tail is folded, that's forming a big yellow spot in the underside of the tail. And you kind of see that here. So that's a surefire way to always identify a yellow warbler, no matter what season you're looking at it. The next pairing that I would like to discuss is Cape May warbler versus yellow-rumped warbler. And you can get some very, very drab individuals of both of these species towards the end of the migration. You'll be looking at first-year females. And so if we were to compare this individual to this individual, we'd be starting to have a very, very tough time. On Cape May warblers, you can find some other features that might be helpful to you, depending on the age of the bird. And you may still find some little bits of yellow here and there that are an aid. You'll see yellow that comes up behind the ear coverts, which can be a clue that you're looking at a Cape May warbler. You can also look at the streaking on the breast, and you can see here that it's fine streaking and very evenly distributed across the breast. Whereas if we look at a yellow-rumped warbler, you'll see that the streaking is not as consistent across the breast. It's more concentrated in the flanks, and it's heavier streaking normally. So that would be one way, a couple of ways that you can separate these two out. But when you get down to these individuals that are very, very dull, then you start to lose all of those features. You can see that we don't have that yellow here, and there's almost no streaking at all in the underparts of this bird. So both birds do have yellow rumps. The yellow is stronger on a yellow rump than it is on a Cape May, but they both do have yellow rumps. One of the features that I like to look at that I find very, very useful, and surprisingly it's easy to see in the field, is to look at the edges of all of the wing feathers or the flight feathers. So the secondaries here and the primaries, you can see that they have an olivey edge to them. And that's going to make this wing section of the wing look a little bit yellowish. And if we look at a yellow-rumped warbler, you can see that those feather edges on the secondaries and the primaries are kind of light grayish. And so that kind of gives us a different look. It's more of a grayish or whitish cast to this area of the wing. So that is enough actually to separate those two birds. And I find that quite handy when you get down to these individuals that are really, really dull in the fall. So now we'll talk about black-throated blue. And certainly if we run into a male black-throated blue, we're not going to have any difficulty identifying that bird. And it does show the characteristic white patch in the wing that's at the base of the primaries. And even in the female, you can see that typically you'll have that feature. So most people rely on that as a surefire way to identify black-throated blue warblers. The problem is that in the fall, you can get some first-year females that will be lacking that white patch. This one's showing just a little tad of white here, but I have seen individuals in the field where there is absolutely no white at all in that area. And so you've lost your main field mark for identifying this bird. And so this is a good example of why you need to have more than one way to identify these birds. When in doubt, when you don't have that white patch, what would be the next thing that you would look for? And what I would suggest is that you look at the facial pattern, and you can see that the lower and the ear coverts are a little bit darker gray than the rest of the head, and certainly contrast a bit with the throat. So a little bit darker gray, and it can be outlined above with a very, very thin supercilium. And you may even have this little slight crescent below the eye. You can see that in both of these individuals. But that facial pattern with the little darker gray in the ear coverts and in the lower is enough to identify this bird. And so you should look for that when you encounter an all drab bird that is lacking the white spot in the primaries. So the last pairing that I wanted to concentrate on today is the Blackburnian warbler versus black-throated green warbler. And in the case where you have first-year females and very poor lighting, you can run into some problems. You can see that the facial pattern is very similar between these two birds. You have a dark lower and dark ear coverts surrounded by a paler color, in this case very yellow, and in this case kind of a drab orange. But the facial pattern is very, very similar. And so in poor light, you may have trouble deciding if you're looking at orange versus yellow. So a couple things that you can use to separate these birds is the fact that black-throated green's back will be completely clean. There'll be no streaking in it whatsoever, whereas Blackburnian warbler will have some faint streaks in it. That can sometimes be hard to see, but you'll be looking very closely at these birds, hopefully, and you should be able to pick that up. Another feature that you often find on black-throated greens, or you should always find on black-throated greens, is toward the lower part of the flank, you should find an olivey wash, and that would be lacking here in the Blackburnian warbler. So there are a couple features that we can utilize that would help separate these two birds. It's a done deal if you find that the throat is all black, but the problem is that you won't always necessarily find that there's black in the throat, and those are the ones that are going to give you problems. So the individual I have here does show some black in the throat. I was not able to find a photograph that was showing exactly what I wanted to share with you today, but this photograph will do fairly well. And again, if you do have the black here, it's a pretty easy separation. It's the ones that will be lacking that, and then again in poor light, looking at that facial pattern, you'll run into a problem. So you will have to look a little more closely, and hopefully you can then, with some serious looking, you can easily be able to separate those two out. It should normally not be a problem. So here are a few surprising similarities that you should be aware of when you're looking at warblers in the fall. That northern parula and magnolia warbler do share a surprising number of characteristics, but there are a variety of field marks that we can rely upon to make that separation. We seldom see yellow warblers in the fall just because they migrate out so early, so be prepared to deal with them. And again, that key feature to look for is the yellow in the underside of the tail. Really dull Cape May warblers and yellow-rumped warblers require a very close look, and if no other clues are evident, then you can always rely on those edges of the flight feathers, whether they are an olivey yellowish color or a pale gray color. That's an easy separation actually in the field. And there's that rare female black-throated blue warbler that might be lacking the white patch in the wing. And so it's a good example of why we need to have more than one identifying field mark when we're trying to separate these birds. And the first year female Blackburnian warblers and black-throated green warblers can at times present a problem. They shouldn't typically be a problem, but in bad lighting or just getting a bad view, you might encounter that fact that the facial pattern is very similar, and being able to discern between that pale orange and a yellowish color might be a problem. So thanks for taking the time to view this video. Hopefully we have given you some bird food for thought. And I hope you'll join us again in the future as we explore all things bird related.